Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm reviewing the Netflix original series Stranger Things. And this is a 8 episode horror series, interestingly set in 1983. And I gotta say right off the bat, I absolutely love the visual look of this series. Um, it also kind of has, for me, a little extra significance in that Stranger Things is set in a small town in Indiana. Now, if you don't know, the word Hoosier is another name for a person from Indiana, and I myself am from Indiana. So I'm not from a small town. My hometown actually is decent sized number of people. Like these days, it's got about 50,000 people. Um, and this is obviously set in a much more smaller, more rural town. So while I might not be from a town like this, I've been in towns like where this is set many, many times. And one thing I really love is it really does look like a small town in Indiana. Now, if you pay attention to the credits, you see this was actually filmed in Georgia somewhere. And hilariously, if you're actually paying attention in episode 3, in the background, you can see outside of what I guess is a courthouse or something, you can see a flagpole, and it's actually flying the state flag of Georgia. And this is, of course, if you're familiar with the Indiana state flag, it's pretty distinctive. But anyway, just a lot of the little details of what you would expect to see in sort of a small town in Indiana are very reflected in where they chose to film this series. So it really does work, and there are like locations and things um, that look like places I have been in Indiana. There's I guess it's sort of a quarry area, and that's some stuff happens in that's pretty important to the series, and it looks like an actual limestone quarry that I'm familiar with, and just sort of the the way the woods are set out and things like this. It really does feel like Indiana, and then just kind of continuing on that, the show being set in 1983. Well, if you watch the series, it obviously takes a lot of cues from stuff like The Goonies and Stand by Me, Poltergeist, Stephen King's It. And incidentally, Stephen King actually got on Twitter and praised Stranger Things. But anyway, and nonetheless, it really is an homage to a lot of the great uh, TV and movies from the 80s, particularly the early 80s. Just the opening credits in like the fonts that they put the credits in, it all looks like something from the 80s. And the clothes that people wear, of course, are reflective of the time period. I love the people at the time. They have these like enormous glasses, which is what glasses looked like back in 1983. You see all these old cars that are obviously were made back in the 70s. Um, the interiors of everyone's house look like complete and utter shit. I mean, seriously, that time in history, particularly like this, coming down off the 70s, and while the 80s had its own very unique style and was very much into the fluorescent colors, it's also that was something that really didn't solidify until a little bit later in the decade. Also, you have to keep in mind that this being a small town in rural Indiana, they're going to be a little bit behind the times. But getting back to it, yeah, the time, everybody's house looks like crap. There's just so much bright yellow and brown and mixed in with red and green. I mean, it looks like if you're just familiar with the time, it's just like people sort of decided they wanted to live in a giant bowl of egg salad, and the bowl was brown. I mean, pay attention to the background. Everybody's house looks like it's just terrible. It looks like crap. But that's what the fashion and interior design was at the time. And boy, are we glad that that time has passed. The houses just look so bad. They look so bad. And there's a lot of nice music from that time as well. And people throw out a couple of cool references. There's actually some fun stuff involving Star Wars, which would be very fitting as Return of the Jedi was released in 1983. In fact, if you sort of pay really close attention to what's going on here, it's very heavily implied that this series takes place in the fall of 1983. So yeah, um, so the atmosphere, the visuals, it's all for me. It just really harkens back to my childhood. And yes, I'm old. I actually do remember the 80s. So yeah. And another big thing about this series is that it has Winona Ryder as one of the main characters. And of course, Winona Ryder, very venerable actress, been in a lot of great stuff. The 80s were, of course, the time when she really came onto everybody's radar, particularly with Beetlejuice, which wouldn't come out until I think like 1988. But it was very cool having her in this series. And I know this is going to be a little bit weird, but one thing I really liked about Winona Ryder's character in this thing is that it actually reminded me a lot of what my aunt was like back in the 80s. Because back then she worked in a store the same way that she worked in a supermarket. Winona Ryder's character seems to work in a general store, and just the way she moves and the way like she smokes cigarettes and things like this, and particularly the way her eyes kind of go when she's really upset, it all reminds me so much of my memories of my aunt when I was a kid. Although in my aunt's case, that thing with the eyes was probably early symptoms of when she would be diagnosed with Graves' disease years later. But yeah, yeah, very cool there for me. But and nonetheless, Winona Ryder's character is on her own merit very cool, and that's another great thing about this series is the characters are all really likable. I mean, the bad guys are kind of stretched thin, are very thin characters. I'll give them that. But the protagonists are are likable characters. They have their flaws, but they're handled well. And what's really great about this series is the main characters are kids. They're junior high school kids. They look like they're probably 12, 13 years old. And having kids as your major protagonist is always a tricky thing if you're doing something that is generally aimed at adults. This is one of the things where you can really see that the creators of the shows really paid attention to movies like Stand By Me and The Goonies, particularly Stand By Me, based on a story by Stephen King, of course, really does the great job of having kids at about that age as protagonists and treating them in such a way that adults are not going to be put off by it or feel like they're just watching something made for kids. And it's a great movie, but it's definitely not for kids. Stand By Me. And I even remember my dad actually was a big fan of that movie. He used to have a poster of it in his bedroom when I was a kid. I remember that. Also had a poster for the band Boston. In all fairness, though, Boston were a good band. They made some great music. But yeah, sorry, I'm just reminiscing into what a fashion decor nightmare my dad's room was back when I was a kid. It very, very, very 70s looking. Dad, I love you, but God Almighty, what were you thinking with some of that stuff, especially the waterbed? Okay, but nonetheless, um, and this kind of brings me to some other things here that while I've mentioned the movies that also have kind of the main influence on this, you can also see little nods to stuff like E.T. and Firestarter, which is after E.T. is sort of the second movie that kind of helped propel Drew Barrymore to fame, also based on a Stephen King novel. If you're familiar with Firestarter, you can't help but notice a little bit of that in one of the characters in this movie. And it's also, of course, it's also really cool to see stuff like the way the characters are playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I've played some D&D myself as well, and that's very cool. And I mean, I don't want to get into spoilers about what's going on with the plot, but I really like that because it's 8 episodes. They don't waste your time. Every episode feels relevant. Stuff that's important happens, and it's very, very nicely atmospheric, as I mentioned before, especially when they sort of slowly build and build and build with the more supernatural elements of what's going on. And you get enough information to feel satisfied by the time everything is over, but you're still left with more than a few questions. And of course, surprise, surprise, they drop some hints that there might be more to the story. And if this series does well, I'm quite sure they'll find a way to do a second season. Um, let's see. Honestly, I can't really think of that. There's too much more that I can really add. Stranger Things is a show that is very clearly a, a love letter to the great movies and great horror stories of that time. And the way that they really go about recreating the atmosphere and just sort of keeping everything in tune with that, while still keeping the story tight, still keeping the characters interesting and enjoyable. I mean, it's just a really great package altogether. And it took a little while to sort of settle into watching the series, but once it really got rolling, I was just like, man, I hate that I have to go to work. I want to be able to finish this. And then, of course, I kind of stayed up late after I got home from work just so that I could polish it off. And I don't regret that in the slightest. Stranger Things is really a very good series that is very much worth your time. So, with that said, I'm going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time. Oh yeah, also please join me on Tumblr at Jedi Reviewer. Until next time, take care and have a good one.